Well, it's Tracy Novick. I got in a couple of questions to do about doing a Worcester Public School budget video. So we're going to see how quickly we can do this. Usually, when I explain school funding, it takes more like an hour. We won't go that long here. As a number of you have noted, if schools are funded exclusively through property taxes, you end up with a fairly inequitable system. So if you're only drawing from local resources, you end up with schools that are very bifurcated in terms of how much funding they have. So in Massachusetts, there actually is a constitutional guarantee to an education. It was written into the state constitution back when John Adams wrote the Constitution back before the Revolutionary War, and as part of a number of lawsuits that were brought against the state during the 1980s and into the early 1990s, the Supreme Judicial Court found in favor of, it was honestly student plaintiffs who sued the state. And as a result of that, the state passed the 1993 Education Reform Law. We mostly know that at the district and school level because that's what gave us the MCAS. It's also what gave us state standards and changed teacher licensure and a whole bunch of other stuff. But at ground, it was actually a state funding reform. So as a result of the 1993 Education Reform Law, we have a two-part system that sort of calculates how each school is funded in Massachusetts. So it starts by looking at the students that we actually have in each school district. So for Worcester, the state got a count of our students from last October 1st. And it looked at not only the grades of each of those students, and I don't mean the grades your teachers give you, I mean what grade you were in. And it also looked at how many students we have that were learning English, and also looked at how many students we had that were considered poor. There's been a couple of different calculations of that. Used to be free and reduced lunch. Now it's whether or not you're on state services. There's actually another change of that potentially might be happening. So it won't surprise anyone who I think is seeing this that Worcester has obviously high rates of both of those categories of students. So the state takes all of that information, and there are categories of funding. So there's a certain dollar amount essentially associated with each student that in the state calculation is supposed to be an adequate amount of funding for that student for that year. So a student can be a kindergartner and a low-income student and an English language learner, and those three things accumulate. So you're in your grade level, plus you get these other things added on. So that added together for the entirety of the district is your what's called your foundation budget. Now I always say it's a foundation for a reason because it's the bottom, it's what's supposed to be underneath. If you build a good foundation, that's great, but usually don't stop there. Do keep in mind that it does include your charter school students. So in the case of Worcester, that's not only Abbey Kelly and Seven Hills, but it's also any students that are going to, say, AMSA or Parker or any of the other charters too. So when you see that dollar amount, it's not all Worcester Public Schools. So for FY21, so we talk in terms of fiscal years, we divide the year between June and July, so we just started a new fiscal year. That amount for the Worcester Public Schools as of January, which was when the governor proposed his state budget, was $398 million. So a couple important things to keep in mind: that does not include transportation. So in the categories of things that the state is imagining that you're going to pay for, we have lots of different districts in the state. This is a standard statewide calculation, so the state doesn't actually include transportation in that. So all of the buses that we run have to go out of local funds. They're not used they don't come out of state funds. There's a couple of other things that aren't included in there, like rental property, adult education, but transportation is obviously the big one. So given that $398 million, which of course again includes not just the Worcester Public School students but also charter school students, the second thing that the state has to figure out is how are you going to come up with that $398 million? So the state looks at two things, and it does this for every single town and city in the state. It looks at what you have for property taxes. So yes, we're back to property taxes again. It also looks at how much income taxes come in from your city or town to the state. So it's an income and property wealth calculation. They do a standard state percentage of each of those across the state. and that gives something, the term for it is combined effort yield. The idea is, given those two kinds of wealth, how much can you as a town or city contribute to public education? I find it actually kind of a handy shorthand, because it's actually a handy measure of community ability to contribute to public education, particularly if you then compare it to their foundation budget. Because foundation budget actually looks at need of students, and combined effort yield actually looks at sort of ability of district to pay. So calculated together, those then give the state an idea of how much the district can afford to contribute. Now, the state doesn't stop just with combined effort yield. They cap how much you're required to contribute. No district is required to contribute more than 83.5% of their foundation budget, so everybody gets some state aid, regardless of how wealthy they are. And they also look at how much you had contributed the previous year. So you're not necessarily giving your combined effort yield, you might be giving less than that, and you might also, there might also be other calculations involved that are going up and down. We can certainly talk about that at greater length, but I'm trying not to get into everything tonight. So given that calculation, in the case of Worcester, the state found that Worcester could contribute $105 million to the $398 million that was our foundation budget for FY21. So given like almost $400 million, the state says to the city, we think you can afford to contribute just over $100 million. So in terms of, you know, where we're at, that the state essentially is acknowledging that Worcester doesn't actually have a great amount of resources to bear, particularly compared to other cities and towns in the Commonwealth. So the state then fills in the gap. So if the city has to contribute the 105, the state then fills in the gap to get us up to 398 million. So that would be 293 million. Again, that doesn't include the charter schools, so that money is going to be subtracted out of that before it comes to the Worcester Public Schools. So if you then take the fact that the city is going to pay for transportation on top of what's there, and you take out the charter schools, the calculations that we had for FY21 when we passed the budget in June was that the city was going to be contributing $113 million, and the state was going to be contributing $274 million of our total. Now, that's not all of the money that we spend. The Worcester Public Schools also get, I'm looking at my book here in front of me, about $32 million in grants and about $15 million coming into us from school nutrition. There's also about $5 million in special revenue funds. Largely that's revolving funds, like money comes in through some sort of a line and then goes back out again. So all of those they're big numbers, but compared to the whole total of the budget, they're actually smaller numbers. So I would say, that is a sort of a takeaway, there's kind of two things to know. One is that Worcester is a very heavily state-funded system. We are more than anything else funded by the state, absolutely far and away. That, though, means two things. First of all, or it doesn't mean two things, but the city is, yes, not contributing much more than it is required to. It is contributing very minimally above what it is required to, particularly when you subtract out transportation. So that part is absolutely true. That, however, it pales in comparison to the fact that the foundation budget itself, as an underlying calculation, has been under-calculated for probably about 20 years. Now, that was the Student Opportunity Act, which was signed in November by Governor Baker, which was putting us on a 7-year plan to changing that and getting us closer to what probably would be closer to adequate. The pandemic and the resulting economic disaster have really put that into question. And today, the state released numbers, which essentially takes last year's state aid and increases it by about 2%, which is nowhere near what we thought we were going to be getting for state aid this year. Once you've subtracted out the charters again, it's probably about $14 million less than the budget that we had passed in June. So in terms of things to be concerned about and things to be organizing about and things to be worried about, the state aid is going to be the major issue, because we already were obviously having to spend more money than necessarily we were expecting. There have been some, the CARES Act went through, there's been some COVID aid that came in, but we now are also looking at losing about $14 million off of the budget we passed in June. I don't know yet what that's going to mean in terms of consequences, in terms of what we're going to have to do. Definitely the school committee will have to be looking at that and doing something. I'm sure administration's already working on it. But in terms of things that are impacts for us right now, the numbers that were released this afternoon are absolutely sort of priority one in terms of the budget. I am going to do a live question and answer session on Sunday at 8 p.m. So by all means, jump on my Instagram, and I'm happy to take questions on the Worcester Public School budget. And if I don't know the answer, I'll try to find out. But either way, by all means, spread the word, and let me know if you have questions on this too. I'm just happy to take them offline too. Thanks.